Good morning. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Thank you for joining us today for our Business Over Breakfast webinar series. We're pleased that you're able to join us in this, our second week back in 2021. Last week, we explored how to build brands in a modern world. And as we continue to reflect on what is important for organizations and leaders in 2021, we focused on helping professionals and executives build their knowledge and skills to lead their organizations to a strong and robust future. When we think about what the organization of the future might be, should be, we're guided by the ideas and leadership of the school's namesake, Roberto C. Goizueta. To Roberto Goizueta, business was a vital element in a greater system, a system that was never meant to exist on its own. He believed business should be used to advance the greater good, and while he was continually committed to raising the bottom line, it was not at the expense of the bigger picture. He felt that solving the world's most complex problems requires a combination of business, government, social responsibility, and education. Today, we're going to focus on one of those complex problems and explore transforming business to build a climate-smart world. Wesley Longhofer, Associate Professor of Organization and Management in the Goizueta Business School at Emory University, is going to be our guide today. He also holds appointments in sociology, ethics, and in the Emory Global Health Initiative. And he's the academic director of the social enterprise at Goizueta team. That's an action-oriented research center that combines academic research with fieldwork programs, student activities, to create better markets, stronger communities, and develop next-generation social innovators. Not only has he received a number of awards for his teaching, he was named one of the 40 best business professors under 40 by Poets and Quants. His research on climate change in the energy sector has been funded by the National Science Foundation and featured in the Washington Post and the Nature Climate Change. He has also co-authored a book, Polluters, tackling the world's largest source of climate disrupting emissions, which was published by Columbia University Press last year in 2020. Wes is going to spend the next 35 to 40 minutes sharing insights on transforming business to build a climate smart world. And please, if you have questions, and I know you do because every week we get lots and lots of questions, put those in the Q&A and we will, as usual, make time for those at the end of the session. If you found Business Over Breakfast sessions to be meaningful, we hope you will consider partnering with us on your professional development and learning journey through a certificate or upcoming course, such as how to approach problems like a management consultant, which is coming up in February, or emotional intelligence, which is coming up in March. Enjoy the morning with Wes, and I look forward to continuing the conversation next week as we bring back Tom Smith with a special guest this time, Bill McKinnon, PhD and Goizueta MBA alum, to discuss the economy and need. Many thanks for joining us this morning, and I look forward to spending the time with you and Wes. Over to you, Wes.
Thank you so much, Nicola, and thank you so much for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to spend this morning hour with you. I know it's an exciting time for some of us. I also know it's a difficult time, and just want to send my best to everybody. I hope that this presentation finds you in good health and good spirits, and everybody is safe. I'm going to split this into two parts. I'm going to talk about the book that just came out, Polluters, and then I'm going to talk about what I think business could do to take on one of the greatest challenges facing our time, which is climate change. I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. So I'm an associate professor of organization and management. Thank you, Nicola, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm the academic director of social enterprise at Goizueta and our new Business and Society Institute that's launching in March. My background is not in business. I tell my students this on the first day of class. I've never started a business. I've never worked for a business. I've never taken a business class. Instead, I'm an organizational sociologist. I'm just fascinated by big structural problems like inequality and climate change and what business can do to help solve them. I'm also the dad of 2 daughters, and I think it's important because it just, I think, illustrates why this is important to me, is that I want them to have a better planet than what we currently have. And so, yeah, I take these issues kind of seriously, but also try and have fun doing it. And I'm hoping that we'll have a good discussion today, and they'll have something to take away about what business can do to take on the climate challenge. I want to start with this quote from Aaron Mizan. It came out in a book that came out earlier this year, or late last fall, I'm sorry, called All We Can Save. It's women, authors, scientists, poets, activists writing about climate change. She is the Vice President, Chief Sustainability Officer at Interface. And I think that this quote sets the stage for how I think about climate change in the context of business, that we need business goals that are bigger than doing less harm or emitting less carbon. The goal has to be what the planet needs, a climate fit for life. And we need optimism and courage to get there, maybe more than we need science or data. And I put that out there. I'm going to present some science and data, but I want us to have that top of mind, that courage and conviction that we can do this, and we can solve the climate crisis. The inauguration of Joe Biden yesterday began with a bunch of executive actions. One of those was to rejoin the Paris Agreement. So it's been rejoiced by climate activists around the world that this is putting the United States back on the global stage, to try and cooperate with other nations to solve the climate crisis. He also stopped the construction of the Keystone Pipeline, and undid a lot of other changes that the former President Trump had made around methane emissions and other things, that it's clear that climate change is also on the new administration's agenda. So I think it's important to set the stage that way, about what role business can play. So let's start with a book. So Super Polluters sounds like a really bad comic book, or maybe like a new Avengers movie with Captain Planet, and maybe it's a new supervillain. We called it Super Polluters because it's a book about power plants. So let me tell you a little bit why we wrote the book. I want to acknowledge my co-authors. Don Grant is professor of sociology at the University of Colorado, leads a lot of their social impact initiatives there. Andrew Jorgensen is a professor of sociology at Boston College. Last year won the Distinguished Career Award from the American Sociological Association for his contributions to environmental sociology. The book asks this question: who is most responsible for climate change? And what if we had data on every single power plant in the world and their carbon emissions? So about 8 years ago, Don and Andrew reached out to me. We're all working in similar spaces, but different fields. And so, well, why don't we just approach this as kind of organizational sociologists, being fairly agnostic about what we would find. But we had this data set. So we got a couple of NSF grants, and some papers came out, and we decided to write a book to kind of put it all together. And that's the book that you see here. Just to give you an example of the book. We write in the book that power plants are the lifeblood and the bane of modern existence. Electrification has revolutionized media and communication. It spurred the rise of the metropolis, advanced healthcare in ways beyond our imagination. Yet even though electrification is the engine of modern society, it's poorly understood by sociologists. So take, for example, the Taichung power plant in Taiwan. This power plant has a productive capacity of 6,000 megawatts. It's the largest power plant in the world. You can see the 75-foot smokestacks, and if you can see those little white birds that are painted on them. It's also the dirtiest power plant in the world at the time that we wrote the book. It pumps about 40 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere each year, which is about the same amount as Switzerland. The IPCC has this is from their most recent report that shows the average global temperature changes from pre-industrial levels. The International Energy Association estimates that CO2 emitted from coal combustion is responsible for 30% of that increase in global average surface temperatures since 1860. Now, oftentimes when you read in the media about climate change, or if you participate in, I took students to the Paris climate change negotiations, we think about this as a problem of nation states. How much CO2 is China emitting? How much is the United States emitting? How much responsibility do they have? We take this approach that climate change is fundamentally an organizational problem. That is to say, it's not nation states that emit carbon, right? It's power plants and automobiles and agricultural farming and other industrial facilities, its populations. It's actually not a nation state issue. We can drill down and go to a sort of a meso level of analysis and say, well, maybe this is a problem of organizations. And the organizations that we argue are most responsible are the power plants that produce electricity. And so we take what we call a super polluters approach, which is, there's 4 things that we focus on in the book. The first is that there are what we call disproportionalities in plants emissions. I'll give an example of what that is, but it just simply says that a small number of power plants account for the lion's share of CO2 emissions in an electricity sector. The second is that there is a paradox of efficiency. And a lot of climate policy focuses on making power plants more efficient, but there is an unintended consequence to doing that, and that increased efficiency may increase output. Then we talk about what we call the social conditions that shape plants' emissions, and I'll just cover that briefly, and then the effectiveness of local policies and activism. So let's begin with this idea of disproportionality. So the first part of the book is simple, yet we hope that it's instructive. So we oftentimes aggregate emissions of organizations to the entire sector. We'll talk about the overall contribution of the electricity sector and the transportation sector and the agricultural sector to climate change. This is helpful, right? So rather than think of individual cars and trucks, we think of the entire transportation sector and its emissions. But this risks producing what we call an ecological fallacy. It can mask differences among those cars and trucks, right? So my Prius doesn't produce the same amount of carbon emissions as a less fuel efficient car. We could argue that this is maybe just because a Prius uses less fuel, right? It isn't because it travels more miles. It isn't because it travels more miles relative to the fuel that it consumes. Maybe this is the case in cars, but it's not necessarily the case in power plants. So we had a couple of papers come out, and we had some coverage of it in the Washington Post. And the point that we made was a simple one. So the point is that a small number of power plants account for the majority of a sector's carbon emissions. So take the United States. In 2009, which is where our initial data came from, the top 5% of polluting power plants accounted for 75% of the sector's total emissions, but only accounted for 47% of its total electricity, right? So it's not simply that power plants that pollute more produce more energy, but there are power plants that pollute more and that beyond the energy that they produce. And this is what we call disproportionality. We argue that this can be helpful, right? So what we did is we took every power plant in the top polluting countries, and we basically ordered them from the dirtiest to the cleanest. And we looked at what happens if you take the top 5% of the dirtiest power plants in a country, and you can reduce their intensity, right? The amount of energy or CO2 that they produce per unit of energy, reduce that intensity to the average for their sector and for the global average of every power plant in the world. I'll just give you one example. So in the United States, if you take the top 5% of the dirtiest power plants and you lower their intensity to their sector's average for just their fossil fuel power plants, you can reduce overall emissions from the electricity sector by 13%. If you can get those power plants to reduce their intensity to the average for the global set of fossil fuel power plants, you can reduce our emissions from electricity by 18%. These numbers jump to, in places like Australia, more than 20% of emissions from the electricity sector can be reduced if we can just get those dirtiest power plants to produce the same amount of energy, just less at a lower level of carbon intensity. The next part of the book talks about this idea of the paradox of efficiency. So if you look at past climate policies, and a good example of this is the Clean Power Plan under Obama, right? The Clean Power Plan, which got held up in the courts, gave states a lot of discretion on how they would reduce their emissions. And when it came to power plants, they could focus on reducing total emissions, they could invest in renewable energy, they could also increase the efficiency of a power plant. This is what we call heat rate improvements, right? Produce more electricity, but burn less coal in the process. Now, efficiency is an interesting thing from an environmental perspective. William Gibbons was a British economist who in the 1860s hypothesized that burning coal would more efficiently might actually increase overall coal consumption. And the idea was simple, right? So if a blast furnace could produce more iron with less coal, then the price of iron would fall, demand would increase, more furnaces would be made, and more coal would be consumed. He called this a rebound effect, where the efficiency gains may be offset by increased consumption. So if you think about light, and this is covered in this New Yorker piece, economist William Nordhaus estimated that an ancient Babylonian would need about 41 hours to acquire enough lamp oil for 1,000 hours of light, right? 41 hours. We can now do that in half a second. We can produce light much more efficiently, and as a consequence, we consume much more light as a result. For power plants, we do see some evidence of this in the United States. So a paper came out that compared the Obama Clean Power Plan with Trump's replacement, which was the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which was shot down in a federal appellate court earlier this week. A recent paper compared the Clean Power Plan, which included beyond the source options for power plants to reduce their emissions, right? So power plants can reduce their emissions by producing more renewable energy. With the Trump administration's rule, which would abolish all of those external options, we call outside the fence line, and simply would allow for plants to improve their heat rate, become more efficient. And the research showed that, sure enough, the Trump plan would have increased emissions. It would have created a rebound effect, whereas the Obama plan would have not. We're able to do this at the global level. So this map simply shows the correlation between what we call a thermal efficiency, this is the inverse of a heat rate, and CO2 emissions from power plants. And so the darker regions, you see a positive correlation. The more efficient the plants are, the more carbon they produce. We do all sorts of other things to run regression models, et cetera, and find that in some countries, plants that emit CO2 more efficiently also emit more volumes of CO2. And what that tells us is that we need policy that focuses on volumes and not rates, right? They're not simply making them more efficient. Now, it's rarely do you see rebound effects that are so great that they offset the efficiency gains of producing more energy with less CO2, but it's not, they're not non-existent. We then turn our attention in the book to what we call the social conditions of power plants, and conceive of power plants as organizations, right? And an organizational sociologist would say that, okay, if you take a power plant, you think of it as an organization, it's sort of a combination of internal and external structures. So I'll give you an example. Take Germany. A lot of social science on climate change will focus on the overall emissions of Germany, and they would look at things like, okay, what's the export intensity of the German economy? Does Germany participate in international treaties and global norms? What's the GDP of Germany? The approach that we take looks at a country like Germany and identifies the organizations within it, right? So this is the dirtiest power plant in Germany. It burns a lot of what's called lignite coal, which is pretty carbon intensive. And we can look at conditions of the plant. So how old is it? What's its fuel source? How efficient is it? Its ownership structure, as well as conditions of Germany. We'll look at, okay, does a power plant like the Niederaußen plant in Western Germany, being the fact that it's located in a country that participates in a lot of environmental agreements, as part of the EU, has pretty aggressive climate regulations and a lot of investment in renewables, does that power plant emit more or less carbon compared to a similar plant in a country that may not participate in those international agreements or may not be investing in renewable energies? So give you an example, right? So some power plants are located in strong economies, but lack a system of political checks and balances. Power plants are utilities. You tend to have a lot of sunk costs, a lot of political control, and a lot of inertia. And so this may affect the degree to which a power plant emits. Other power plants are located in countries that are disengaged from global environmental norms. Other plants are older, owned by dominant utilities, which can create inertia, and so on. So in the book, what we do is we create these typologies based on a statistical technique called qualitative comparative analysis, where we can look at the combination or constellations of these different factors. And we argue that there are 4 configurations that sort of characterize the majority of super polluting power plants. Some are more coercive, they're in sort of economically central countries, but they're disengaged from the global environmental norms, and there's fewer checks and balances. Some are more inertial, and this helps us, right? So if we want to develop policy or future social science focused on super polluters, these configurations can be instructive to tell us what makes a super polluter pollute more, above and beyond demand for energy, above and beyond its own efficiency. And then finally, we look at the effect of policies and activism. And we have data just on the United States. We ask, can US states' climate and energy policies, as well as civil society, reduce plant emissions, right? So if we can agree that one solution to climate change is to reduce the emissions of super polluters, make them just emit at the average rate of plants in their country, what effect do policies and sort of local civic action have? So we looked at a number of different policies that states have adopted. Some are climate-focused policies, such as emissions caps, targets on greenhouse gas emissions, and a lot are indirect. Efficiency targets for power plants and buildings, renewable energy portfolio standards, public benefit funds, and electric decoupling. And what we find is that even those indirect policies, such as efficiency targets or renewable energy portfolios, can reduce power plant emissions when they are combined with local civic organizations. A good example of this is the Midwestern Power Collaborative, it's an ongoing collaboration between utilities and environmental NGOs to reduce the emissions of the power sector. All right, so that's what the book is about. We have a number of other projects that are coming out of it, and a new NSF grant that we're working on that focuses really on this climate policy question. But I want to talk more about what I think business can do. Why should we think about what can we learn from this approach for what businesses can do to address climate change? So let's talk about this idea of transforming business. Here's some good news. So you may have seen there was a recent survey in the New York Times last weekend. And then it comes from the Yale Climate Change Communication Program, as well as similar surveys at George Mason, Utah State. This is a county level map that shows in 2020, 72% of adults think that global warming is happening, right? And this is a shift, right? You've seen a growth in awareness in global warming over the past few years. If you look at registered voters, including Republicans, support many climate-friendly energy policies. This came from that New York Times report. So look at tax rebates for purchasing energy-efficient vehicles, fund more research into renewable energy sources, generate renewable energy on public land, regulate carbon dioxide emissions as a pollutant. That we're starting to see more widespread agreement that policy is needed. These are the percent of adults who support regulating CO2 as a pollutant. So think about something like a carbon tax for power plants. So you might see more widespread public support than we might anticipate just based on how the debate is framed in politics or the media, that 75% of Americans support a policy like that. And then 7 in 10 registered voters want corporations and industry to do more to address global warming. And in fact, corporations and industry is at the top of the list in terms of the most support for which social actors should do more. So what can business do? Oftentimes, when we think about business addressing climate change, we might think of headlines like these. That big business says it will tackle climate change, but not how or when. And this was a piece in the Times about Davos, where Larry Fink and others were making big statements about climate change. And whereas Larry Fink was pretty clear what BlackRock was going to do and divest all of their actively managed funds from coal and fossil fuels, a lot of other statements was less clear. And then the one on the right was based on a Bloomberg study that looked at first quarter shareholder calls and mentions of climate change in 2020 and the last quarter of 2019. Right, so the first quarter of 2020 is when the pandemic hits. Mentions of climate change and shareholder calls dropped 50% in 2020. So there is this fear that business isn't being transparent about what they want to do, or that their concern for climate change is ephemeral, that maybe it's not strategic. Here's what I think that business can do. to build a more climate smart world? I think they can do 4 things. And these, I recognize that we all come from different backgrounds. We work in different industries at different levels. And so I'm going to keep these fairly high level. But I think one thing is that business can restore faith in science. You do that through accountability and transparency. I also think that business needs to recognize that climate change is a justice issue. And we'll talk more about that. I think that businesses need to advocate for a more climate smart policy agenda. That's pretty clear that if you want to decarbonize the economy, we need government intervention, but business can play a part in that rather than wait for it to happen. And then we need to learn as educators and as business students how to decouple growth from environmental harm. So let's talk first about restoring faith in science. So Ronnie Chatterjee and Mike Toffel have a wonderful paper about CEO activists. And this is one of the things that students in my class love discussing is, can CEOs be activists? And it's a relatively kind of new phenomenon. And what they found is that when CEOs make statements on political and social issues, they do have the ability to shift public opinion. And they found this in a study of religious freedom laws. I looked at statements by Tim Cook and others in response to religious freedom laws that were being adopted in North Carolina, Indiana, and other states. However, they don't find so in the case of climate change. And I think that's an interesting puzzle, is that why can CEOs shift public opinion on religious freedom laws, but not on climate change? Part of the reason is that we're pretty sort of stuck in our views and our acceptance of climate change. This is a study looking at it's the same survey, right? So you have 72% of Americans, adults, say global warming is happening. Only 57% think that's caused by human activities, right? So it's a little more than half think that climate change is anthropogenic, that's caused by humans. And then 55% agree that or believe that most scientists think global warming is happening, right? So there's a lot of disagreement on whether or not there's sort of a scientific consensus. Now, the scientific consensus on climate change is somewhere between 90 and 100%, right? So it's a pretty large disconnect between what scientists agree is happening and what Americans think science agrees on. So maybe this is the challenge, right? Maybe this is the challenge that maybe business can play a role in restoring faith and belief in science. How can they do that? Well, one thing is for companies to set what we call science-based targets. This emerged in 2018 in response to, probably in response to the Paris Accord. So when the previous administration announced that they were going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, you saw hundreds of companies sign on to letters saying that we're still in the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord asked countries to set targets by 2030 on how they're going to reduce emissions to prevent an overall temperature increase of 1.5 to 2 degrees. So the Science-Based Target Initiative helps businesses do that. So how can a business set a climate change target that is in line with the scientific understanding of what it's going to take to prevent that average temperature increase of 1.5 to 2 degrees? Just to give you one example. So Ørsted is a Dutch utility. It was a fossil fuel company. And about 4 years ago, when they decided they wanted to set a science-based target, they realized that they wanted to actually reduce their emissions by 2030 to be in line with the 1.5 temperature degree increase. They would have to shift from a fossil fuel company to a renewable energy company. They described this as the 85-15 split, right? It was decided on by executive management, reflected the ambition to conduct a complete turnaround of our generation mix. So they were a mix of 85% fossil fuels, 15% renewables. They wanted to flip that to 85% renewables, 15% fossil fuels. Their expectation was they could do that in 30 years. They did it in less than 10. They invested a lot in off and onshore wind energy, working with Siemens to produce turbines more cost efficiently. They bought wind energy companies, onshore wind energy companies in Texas, but they completely shifted their energy mix because they wanted to meet that science-based target. Another thing that companies can do to restore faith in science is to be transparent, right? And to disclose their climate impacts. So CDP is a advisory NGO that works with companies to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, so their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, as well as disclose other things like climate leadership. So does somebody on your board have oversight on climate change? And as you can see from 2015, the number of companies that have disclosed their climate impacts has increased about 70%. Now, that's about 9,000 companies that disclose their climate risk and climate impacts in 2020. If you do a quick Google search of how many companies there are in the world, it's somewhere around 200 million. So most companies don't do it through CDP, but CDP provides a template. And in my class, we look at CDP and give examples and what happens when companies disclose. And there's some evidence that disclosure does reduce your emissions, or it creates accountability. So I think this is really important. Restore faith in science through accountability and transparency. Another thing that business has to recognize is that climate change is also a justice issue. So you saw this last year, or 2019, when we saw the walkouts at Google and Amazon, employees walking out, oftentimes with using the language of climate justice to raise concerns about the climate impacts of Google and Amazon, to push leadership to set more ambitious climate targets. Climate justice recognizes that there are disproportionate adverse effects on underprivileged populations from climate change. So let me give you an example. This was a piece that came out in the Times just last year. It's based on a paper that came out in Climate that looked at the effect of redlining policies in the 1930s and climate impacts in present day. And so to give you an example, so if you are familiar with redlining, this was housing policies in the 1930s where different districts and cities were deemed either sort of best for providing mortgage loans or hazardous. That's the redlining, and these were predominantly Black and immigrant communities. This is the average temperature difference in present day in communities and cities that were graded best in 1930 for providing mortgage loans and those that were redlined and graded harshest. So to give you an example, in Atlanta, neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s are on average nearly 8 degrees warmer on a hot summer day than neighborhoods that were graded best. Why? There's less tree cover, less green spaces, more pavement. You see this across a number of metropolitan areas that even within cities, there is disproportionate effects of climate change based on zip codes and neighborhoods in which you live. This is crucial for companies that are working in communities, companies that want to support their employees to recognize the adverse effects of climate change within a community or within a city based on climate and how climate change intersects with housing policies, with race, with income, with location. Fascinating research in the literature on diversity suggests that this is important for how we frame problems in the context of business. So take the business case for diversity. Research by Jamila Bowman-Williams, a law professor at Georgetown, finds that the business case for diversity has the potential to actually increase biased decision-making, whereas the justice or legal case for diversity tends to increase support among employees. I think this could be similar in the case of climate change. We know that in the literature on corporate social responsibility, that the business case for CSR is a key motivator, right, for a lot of social responsibility initiatives. But the business case also dampens our emotional reactions or moral reactions to the problem. And if we're always looking for the business case and not seeing this as a justice issue, it might put blinders on what climate action might be necessary to solve the crisis. More and more resources are coming out to help corporations and help businesses think about climate justice. So the B Corp Climate Collective, B corporations, if you're familiar, are corporations around the country that take a sort of a more stakeholder approach in their incorporation. B Lab is certified companies that look after the earth and the planet, their employees and communities as part of the business model. So Ben & Jerry's, New Belgium, Patagonia are some of the ones that we think of. They have resources on climate justice to help business leaders think about climate justice in their own positions, help employees think about it, a lot of examples in case of companies that are approaching climate change with a lens of climate justice. The third thing I think that business can do to build a climate smart world is to advocate for climate smart policy. So this is the falling cost of renewable energy since 2009. Dramatic decreases in cost of solar technology have made renewable energy more cost effective than it ever has been. But it varies so much by state. So I'll give you an example. The Retail Industry Leaders Association puts out annual reports on how easy it is for corporations and states to procure renewable energy. Georgia has made tremendous gains, but we are still only ranked 28th for policies that enable companies to procure renewable energy, because we don't have net metering, we don't have renewable energy portfolios, that these things could make it easier for companies in Georgia who want to meet and procure renewable energy, make it easier for them to do so. It's clear that government action is necessary, right, to decarbonize our existing energy infrastructure. But I think it would be naive to think that business doesn't play a role in that. Just last week, we saw companies use their political contributions as a way to make political statements following the January 6th attack on the Capitol. There's an increasing push to get companies to do the same with regard to climate. So a lot of movements in California to get big tech to sort of match its own climate goals with its lobbying efforts on renewable energy. There's an open letter to CEOs of corporate America to take a lead on climate policy. We also need industry cooperation, and it's needed at scale. Give you one example. So in the mid-2000s, Greenpeace was concerned about deforestation in the Amazon in Brazil. So the Amazon was being cut down to produce soy. And so they dressed up like chickens and they went to McDonald's to protest the trashing of the Amazon. This led McDonald's, ADM, Cargill, and others to put pressure on the Brazilian government to reduce deforestation. And they created a soy moratorium, that they weren't going to buy soy unless they could certify that it wasn't being produced on deforested land. What they saw in the first 10 years of the soy moratorium was that soy production in Brazil doubled, but only 1% of that soy came from land that was deforested. And it's seen as a success in how business can work with government, right? Because government has to enforce the moratorium, but businesses put pressure on them in response to activism. It's a good example of business cooperation with government to try and prevent deforestation. Now, a lot of this has changed with the election of Bolsonaro, but at least in that first 10 years, we saw an increase in soy production and a decrease in deforestation as a result. I'll give you another example. So Project Drawdown is a project of Paul Hawken, an ecologist, and a team of scientists and writers and activists and others who produced a list of the 100 top solutions to climate change to actually draw down to negative emissions. And we have our own Drawdown Georgia, which is a fantastic project. Emory's involved in it, Georgia Tech, and some others, to see what these solutions are in Georgia. One of those solutions is regenerative annual cropping, right? The idea is that land is a carbon sink. And so if we can produce cotton and food and other things without tilling the land, with placing cover crops to protect the land, we can keep a lot of that carbon in the land rather than going into the atmosphere. And so Patagonia was one company that helped develop a certification. The certification is important, right? It helps create standards. It's transparent. It helps signal to consumers that the product meets certain standards with regard to regenerative agriculture. They developed the certification, and then you see cooperation from shoe brands. So Adidas and Allbirds working together to source their cotton that is regenerative organic certified. That was certification created by Patagonia and others, to then produce a shoe that would have the lowest recorded carbon footprint of a shoe. This is a good example of taking a climate change solution that had, what's nice about regenerative annual cropping is that it's a modest decrease in emissions, but it's incredibly scalable and it's incredibly cost effective in terms of the long-term cost savings, to take that climate change solution, develop a certification, and then develop business cooperation and new products. And then finally, I think we need to learn to decouple growth from harm. So Andy Hoffman at the University of Michigan has probably written some of the most on sustainability in business, and had this wonderful piece in 2018 about management as a calling. And says there are things that we could do in business schools to solve the climate crisis. And partly it's about how we teach business. So he says that we need to offer critical education in the nature, evolution, and future of capitalism. He writes that our society may possess a knee-jerk phobia about questioning capitalism, but the truth is quite malleable, designed by humans in the service of humans, and it can evolve to meet the changing needs of humans. He argues that we need to teach responsible government lobbying, right? So that goes back to leaning into the policy process and lobbying for clean energy, effective clean energy policy that makes it easier for companies to meet their own climate goals if they can procure renewable energy locally. And he also says we need to add natural science to the MBA curriculum to increase our climate literacy among our MBA students. Which brings me to our Business and Society Institute. So those of you who follow social enterprise at Goizueta, we've been around for about 10 years and have an amazing team. We're an action-oriented research center, do a lot of work with entrepreneurs in low-income communities in Atlanta, incredibly impactful and creative work with coffee farmers in Central America, and have a number of student programs. We got a really generous gift in 2019 from the Goizueta Foundation to launch the Business and Society Institute, which is the next phase of social impact work here at Goizueta. Our mission is to transform business, to build a more equitable and climate smart world through cutting edge research, innovative programming, and principled leadership and teaching. We are launching officially in March, and we're going to have a conversation with Harvard Business School professor Rebecca Henderson. She recently wrote a book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. It's a big motivation for what we're trying to do in the Institute, to take some of those ideas and put it into action. She writes a lot about business cooperation to solve the climate crisis. And that'll be Thursday, March 4th at 7 o'clock. We'll put the registration link in the chat. And that's it. Hopefully there's some takeaways, found something interesting. And I wish I had breakfast for you all, but hopefully you found something to snack on. And I look forward to some questions.
Thanks so much, Wes. Well, we've got a lot of great questions in the chat, so hopefully we can get to a number of them. Wanted to kick off with this one from Stephen Howard. So the question is, it's multi-question, 2 questions in it. So the first question is, what incentives or penalties do you recommend to drive efficiency targets that you suggest? And then what behavioral drivers would be consequential to shift the behavior of owners of power plants, particularly in other nations?
Those are big questions. I think the first one, I think a carbon tax. There's increasing support for it from economists, from companies that are starting to implement their own internal carbon taxes. We need a price on carbon. The price has to be fair. The market has to be fair. Government would have to probably enforce it, but I think that would be, we need some version of that. It's something that Rebecca Anderson talks a lot about, and we're going to chat about it in March. So I think that's at the plant level, sort of policy plant level. At the behavioral level, gosh, I wish I had a good answer to that. Right, part of it is this business case, right? Like, it's really hard to imagine running a fossil fuel power plant when there's no more fossil fuels. And so part of it is looking sort of at long-term time horizon. So how can we incentivize business leaders and businesses to look at the long-term impact? There is a big market right now for investments in renewables. So the more we can learn from companies like Ørsted and others that are switching their energy mix, but I think that requires the right kind of policy environment, that requires a different understanding of what business growth is. Business growth that takes into account impact on the climate. I think that existential question is the hardest for utility owners and fossil fuel power plants. I'm going to look into this though, because now this is going to bug me all day to think of what those behavioral incentives might be.
Thank you, Wes. Could you share your perspective on the environmental impact of cryptocurrency or Bitcoin mining?
Interesting question. Yeah, so all those the stories that came out about a year ago about the incredibly carbon intensive crypto mining. I mean, if you follow Bitcoin isn't doing so well right now. And I don't know. I'm not an expert in it, to be honest. I read all the stories about people who can't unlock their Bitcoins and all the money that they're losing. And then there is a bigger kind of philosophical question about if that is the right kind of, if the priorities are correct in running creating a new currency that has such a large climate impact to run those servers. But I don't have a better answer than that, other than I think it's an important issue that smarter people would have a better answer for. Sorry.
Wes, can you speak to the responsibilities of consumers to demand fewer and buy fewer of the goods that give rise to bad climate effects?
This is a really important issue, and it's what spent a lot of my business and society class talking about. So if you look at, so there's always this idea that maybe about 30% of consumers care about these issues and actually change their consumption patterns. And a lot of that comes from organic purchases. So about 30% of consumers buy organic products on a regular basis, roughly. And is that maybe the peak at which point consumers make choices? I think that consumers are incredible, because I am one, we are incredibly fickle, we are incredibly habit driven. We don't always have access to information, and that limits the capacity of consumers alone to drive this change. One of the things I'm really excited about is Unilever. So Unilever is planning to label all of their products with its carbon footprint and its climate impact. Now you're talking about how many thousand brands and how many tens of thousands of different products that they could actually do that. They would provide information to consumers to make choices. But I think that consumption is a really complicated, we're talking in classes, consumption is a social process. And when you appreciate it as a social process, you realize the power of ethical consumption, right? You can create movements of consumers to demand change, but also the limits. That there are lots of reasons why we consume. And I think I think business has, I believe in the power of business to sort of shape consumption, that if business wanted to create the ethical consumer, they probably could, just in the same way they create, the Cheetos and Doritos consumer. I think that by how they do that, I'm excited to see if this labeling project that Unilever is doing has an impact. But I'm a little bit hesitant to say that consumers alone can solve the problem without business kind of jumping in.
Wes, do you believe modern technology, nuclear power plants have a place in our future?
So I'm also a bit of a pragmatist, and I think that we need a really diversified energy mix. And so I go back and forth on how much of that should be nuclear. Obviously, the risk of nuclear disaster is immense, and it can be catastrophic, but most of the time it's safe. And I feel like right now, if that's where I think we have widely underutilized our ability in renewables. And so I think that should be our first step, is to increase renewable capacity and have the right kinds of state policies to allow utilities to set up regional grids and allow corporations to purchase renewable energy. That should be our first step. I also think nuclear, we see this in Georgia right now. It's incredible. A lot of resources, a lot of money is needed to build nuclear. It just doesn't seem as wise an investment as renewables right now. But I think I'm not as opposed to it as some environmentalists, but I don't think that we should necessarily be pursuing it at the cost of investing in more renewables.
Thank you, Wes. So another question here. What can individuals or individual businesses do to use energy more efficiently? And what impact can this have on emissions overall?
I think it's interesting to see what happens obviously there's huge differences across businesses and industries. There are some industries where it's incredibly hard, right? Air travel is a good example. Although Delta's ambitious goals, if they can actually create different energy sources, which show other airlines how to do it. I also think that, we saw emissions drop in 2020 because of the pandemic and because there was a decline in travel and transportation, air travel. But it's also going to, I'm hoping that companies can come out of the pandemic and reimagine the workspace a little bit and create more workplaces that work better for their employees. And that may change where we work and how we work. Technology that we've taken advantage of, like Zoom through the pandemic, shows that we can do work in different ways. And that can decrease emissions, and we can decrease our reliance upon travel. But it's also, I think, going to require some companies to reimagine their business models a little bit. I tell my students, we give the example of an e-retail company that can send things to you within hours or a day, and the emissions impact of that. If we slow down, if we can somehow convince companies to slow down our consumption a bit, that could decrease their emissions dramatically. There are lots of specific strategies based on the size of company you are and the industry you work in that we could chat about. I think in a general level, it's asking sort of what kind of growth, what kind of growth and impact, business impact do you want to have? And at what point does it become at an expense of the climate? And I think there are technological and efficiency solutions to that, such as reducing air travel and reimagining the workplace.
Wes, in an effort to spark conversations at the workplace, could you recommend any resources for increasing climate literacy and overall understanding?
I think the Yale the climate communication resource is a good one because it helps give a sense of where people are coming from and what's, I think the maps that show widespread understanding that global warming is happening, but then a lack of understanding perhaps or appreciation for the what scientists believe are the role of humans in causing it. There's some great stuff at business schools, like Harvard Sustainability Program has some great resources. The B Corp Collective, so that climate collective from the B Corporations, I think is a good one. So there's a lot of really accessible resources there on how to learn more about climate change, and also how to talk about climate change. And a lot of examples of businesses that are kind of on the cutting edge of this. And there's just a lot of resources out there for podcasts and Climate One, for example, the NPR podcast is a great one every Sunday morning. I have a lot of other ones. Feel free to connect with me and we could share some resources on, there's a lot out there depending on what you're looking for.
Thanks, Wes. Lots of great resources. A question here from Chris Gregory. As we move to more electric cars in the future, do you think we will also have to create more power plants to charge these cars? And do you think they'll be able to make it more or less harmful on the environment to make and recycle the batteries after their useful life?
So this is where I should have prefaced that I'm not an engineer and I'm not a climate scientist. But the research that I've read, so the better research that we have suggests that the environmental impact of recycling and producing the lithium batteries for electric cars does not outweigh the environmental impact of not producing them, of relying upon gas engines. And so I think that it's not clear that we can go straight from diesel and gas powered transportation to electric and we'll solve the climate crisis, that there still is an environmental cost to doing that. But everything I've read suggests that's less impactful than our current transportation system. As far as the power plants, I don't know if you would require more power plants or just a different kind of grid to make, like we had more regional grids and microgrids, perhaps that could be used. And it should not be necessary, I don't think, to build more coal-fired power plants to power electric cars. If that's the solution, then we haven't probably done our job. We have to figure out some kind of more sustainable way to power it. But that's a bit outside my area of expertise.
Thank you, Wes. What does the data show about nuclear and natural gas as part of the solution to reduce emissions?
Well, so nuclear is zero emissions, right? So we know that nuclear can be a part of the mix to meet climate goals. The problem with nuclear is the waste issue and the risk issue. Natural gas is less carbon intensive, right? So this is one first step for a coal plant, is to try and switch to natural gas, especially as natural gas became cheaper. But it's not zero emissions, right? It's not going to be the same as renewables. And so we should not, I don't think that we should invest in natural gas at the cost of investing in renewables. But it's part of the solution, right? We know that in terms of energy mix, coal-fired power plants, and this is why every climate policy eventually leads to the closing of coal-fired power plants. And we've seen that happen over the past few years. That is a good first step. But natural gas alone isn't going to, I don't see how we can meet our, even if you read the stories coming out today about what it would take for the Biden administration to meet their 2030 goals for the Paris Climate Agreement, you're talking about a $2.5 trillion investment in renewable energy and new infrastructure for energy. I don't see how we can meet those incredibly ambitious and deadlines that are coming up very, very soon by simply switching to natural gas. So I think it may be a part of the transition, but I don't think that it could be the primary solution.
Thanks so much, Wes. So we've got our last question here. So what can business leaders do to educate their staff and consumers as to what if action is not taken beyond the general terms of we need to tackle climate change and their lack of action will have on the future?
I think part of it is, being transparent, right? And creating those accountability mechanisms. So disclosing climate impacts, I think that could be really important for your employees as much as it is for investors, as much as it is for consumers and activists. And so see that as an important source of information for your employees. I think we also underestimate how much our employees care about this, right? Those climate surveys from Yale, somewhere around 60 to 70% of people worry about climate change, worry about global warming, right? Those are our employees. The walkouts at Amazon and Google, these are ways that employees are oftentimes a lot of social responsibility and sustainability initiatives come from employees. And so I think it's about business leaders, as much as leading and educating their employees, is listening to their employees and creating spaces for employees to express their concerns, right? Because our employees are living in communities that are impacted by climate change. They're concerned about it because of their children, for the same reason that I'm concerned about it. So part of it is as much listening to our employees as it is about leading and educating them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wes, for joining us this morning and your time, for sure. Thank you so much. And thank you also to our attendees that join us each and every Thursday. As we wrap up today's session, we would like to share a couple of things with you. Closing out January Business Over Breakfast will be Professor Tom Smith and Bill McKinnon. Kicking us off February 4th will be Randy Lucius with Performance Management and Social Justice. And there's more to come in February as well. Just to share a few upcoming courses that we have. If you attended our Problem Solving Business Over Breakfast series back in May, how to approach problems like a management consultant is a great follow-up course, but here's a few of our courses that we have coming up until March for the spring. That information on how to get more information on these upcoming courses will be located in the chat. And again, as a reminder, a recording of today's session will become available on the Executive Education LinkedIn page, which will also be in the chat for you to click through. Also, if you just take a few minutes to complete the survey that will pop up in your browser shortly, we value your feedback and we would greatly appreciate it. And thank you again, Wes, for joining us this morning. Is there any closing remarks that you have?
No, thank you so much for being here. And I think there are no easy solutions to any of these issues that we talked about, but I think if we could have spaces to have these conversations in the context of business, I think that is a good first step. And so thank you all for being here. This was a lot of fun, and feel free to follow up with me with questions or offline to chat more about your interests. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And again, thank you to all of our participants.